Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. Our topic today is corruption. In this second Trump presidency, we've seen a fusion of public power and private wealth and personal gain that we've really never seen before. We want to understand it, understand what got us here, and talk about what we can do about it. And we have two extraordinary experts to help us understand this and to really unpack the complexities here. Dan Weiner is the director of the Elections and Government program at the Brennan Center and one of the country's leading legal activists on the issue of money and politics. And Jane Mayer is a staff writer for The New Yorker, the author of books including Dark Money, an absolutely foundational book for understanding the role of big money in American politics. She hosts the weekly politics podcast at The New Yorker, is working on a new book, which we'll talk about, on the conservative movement and money and the Supreme Court, and much more, and an extraordinary analyst and leading investigative journalist on all of this. And Jane, what is different about this moment and what we're seeing right now?
Well, first, Michael, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be with you. I am so grateful for the Brennan Center and all that it does in this area, and great to be with Dan, too, who's just an extraordinary resource and brain on the subject. So thanks for having me. And so if, to sort of use the framework of Passover, why is this corruption different from all other corruption? It is in its dimensions, in almost every dimension. But if you think of corruption as basically two buckets, one is systemic, the corruption of the system, and the other is kind of venal corruption, people just taking money to themselves. It's beating all records in both ways. I mean, so you basically have, in the case of President Trump, you have for the first time a president who has not divested himself from his business interests or his family's business interests, and who is directly enriching himself using the power of the United States government and influence that comes with that to do so. And then you have the corruption of the system that he is overseeing, where you can see in so many ways that we're sort of dizzy from day to day, how the mechanism of the federal government is being corrupted to serve private rather than public interests, whether it's petty vengeance, going after the president's enemies, or enriching his benefactors who supported him during the campaign, or it's just simply using it to intimidate, perhaps, in the case of the FCC, news organizations that might be politically in opposition to him, or just critics. You can see it in pretty much every level, every day. And so what we're seeing is really extraordinary. I've been a reporter since covering Reagan for the Wall Street Journal, and I've never seen anything remotely like it.
There really arguably has not been anything like this in American history. We almost lack the language to understand it and narrate it. I think about the Medicis with their slogan of money to get power to protect the money, or other things of that nature. Dan, as you think about it, what do you see as special about this moment for us to understand?
Well, it's such a good way to start, because I think we need to sort of start first of all, like, by asking ourselves, what is corruption, right? And we sort of talk about it as everything, sometimes just everything's bad, but we're talking here about, the abuse of public office for private or parochial gain, right? And I think Jane put it very well, in just how this has just broken all records. If you look at our history, right, we've, as you said, we've always had corruption with us. When I think about it, I think of sort of three things that are maybe different. So the first one, right, is, as Jane alluded to, just the incredible explosion of self-dealing at the very top of the government, right? We've always had that to some extent, but this idea that you have a president who hasn't divested from his businesses, who now has a crypto business that's raking in billions of dollars that people can just pay into if they want to ingratiate themselves with him. And that is intersecting, right, with a presidency itself that has been transformed. And maybe we'll talk about that later. The powers of the presidency are different than they've ever been, at least in recent memory. You then add, and Jane has written a lot about this, you add that to a campaign finance system where basically all the guardrails have fallen away, right? And so we now are sort of elections dominated by super PACs.
Or been kicked away.
Or kicked away, right. They've not just, right, they just didn't fall away spontaneously. There's a process there. I want to get one other thing in, which is that the way that we get information now, right, is this incredible centralization of the attention economy online in a couple large companies, often dominated by a couple oligarchs. Those people can use their control of the attention economy for partisan reasons. They can also use it for profit-making reasons. And I think that poses a whole new challenge that is really different. I mean, we had the yellow press before, the yellow journalism, but nothing like this in terms of just the domination of literally how you define political reality. Is very different than what we have seen before.
Do you agree with that, Jane, that the centralization of media in a few hands, that actually both creates the wealth inequality that is part of a lot of this, but it also changes how people hear things. It makes it harder to expose scandal. But there was a time, of course, when people paying money for 30-second ads on broadcast television was the driver of a lot of the campaign finance corruption. And do you think that the changing media and economic infrastructure has a big role here?
Oh, absolutely. Tremendous. I mean, if you have a handful of huge media organizations owned by a handful of oligarchs, you're not likely to see a lot of rip-roaring coverage of corruption in the hands of oligarchs. I mean, you're basically, the reporters are left having to write about their own bosses, and that's a difficult spot to be in. So, I mean, the centralization of ownership of the media is certainly a big part of it, and we don't really see an awful lot of mainstream and certainly not right-wing coverage of things like economic inequality and about sort of the oligarchical power concentration and corruption in elections. There's the reason why we're having this conversation with the Brennan Center. We don't have that. It's a nonprofit. It's part of, you know, it's not part of the regular sort of media ecosystem. It's hard to get those conversations in the regular media ecosystem. So sure, it makes a big difference. And then meanwhile, of course, the media system has completely splintered. So whereas in the past, you might have been able to see just a few, you could see the ads on the three major networks or whatever, or five as it came to be, or maybe then cable. Now you've got social media, you've got digital ads, you've got all kinds of sort of surreptitious ways of influencing politics online. And it's incredibly hard to spot the money, see the influence. So there are new opportunities for corruption and less coverage of corruption, if you're going to summarize that.
I mean, it's sort of the thought experiment, right, of if Watergate happened today, right? It would be a one-day story. You know, lies would be, you know, the White House would say, oh, this is all a lie, and then we'd move on, right? Because the splintering of the media landscape is so different. So it can give rise to corruption. It can make harder. I think Jane is absolutely right that the splintering of the media landscape can make it harder to uncover corruption in other areas as well.
Well, and the Fox News equivalent would be saying they were fighting fighting communism in the DNC office, and
interesting paradox too, because it's the splintered media landscape, except it's all owned by like three guys.
Well, but that's if there are historians in the future. If they have historians in the future, of course, the image of the Trump inaugural with the wealthiest people in the country, most of them, sitting in the front row in front of the cabinet was such a striking new Gilded Age image. But they weren't just the wealthiest people. They were all wealthy in various ways, in part from owning these media properties or these means of communication, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon and the like. And Larry Ellison was not there, but he who is now both the wealthiest person and his family just, of course, took control of CBS. It's part of trying to understand all of this. Let's dial the clock back.
Wait, before you leave that, just let us not forget, since that tableau, I agree with you, Michael, was a historic one. And because of the amount of oligarchical money and power that was paying homage to Donald Trump, people, many of them who had opposed him in the past and were now lined up to sort of basically give their fealty to him, and among them, some of them have actually just plain given him or his family straight out cash, money. Look at the case of the Bezos family that owns the Washington Post. What did they do shortly after that? Amazon cut a deal where it bought the rights for the autobiography of the First Lady, Melania Trump, and paid her $28 million in cold cash to have the rights to turn her story into some kind of Amazon docudrama or whatever. Listen, I've made documentaries and been in documentaries.
You didn't get that?
$28 million, a lot more money than the ordinary documentary. It's like we're watching as there's these corporate titans are it's almost like shakedowns. They're handing money to the Trump administration and Trump family. And
literally to Trump and his family. The payment from ABC was to Trump, not to the government, not a fine or something like that. My recollection is that both Twitter and Facebook settled for one reason or another with Trump personally, which is paying him or his library directly, and that's part of the what's so different about this. And then of course the routinized threat now with the Federal Communications Commission going after these companies, backstopping his personal threats and desires, makes the regulated industries anyway even more willing to do that.
I think it's worth remembering too that we tend to talk about as the oligarchs being the one that hold the cards. That's not often the case. With the presidency having so much power, it is often can turn into something more like protection money, right? The companies may feel like they need to do these things to make sure that they can do other, whatever else they want to do, particularly since a lot of them have things like mergers. With these conglomerates, you own a media company, but you also own a healthcare company, but you also own a publisher, and you have broadcast licenses, and that centralization of the economy can then be a breeding ground for the kind of corruption we're talking about.
Well, and let's not forget that one of the reasons that our system moved from tariffs to a broadly applied income tax was precisely because the tariffs were a major source of corruption in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when that was the way the federal government was largely funded. Because everybody wheedles for an exception, the rates are different, there's all kinds of game playing, and as you and I have discussed, conservatives and libertarians would argue that this public choice theory, that part of what's causing this is that government is bigger, government is more powerful. When government does more stuff, then people in the private sector, among other things, feel they need to engage in what we would regard as corrupt activities to deal with that. Do you buy that?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I'm glad you gave conservatives their due a little bit here, because we're sitting here talking about this as, Trump, this is terrible. I want to note that folks on the right have been warning about some of this stuff for a while. The worry about big tech, whether you agree with the specific concerns they had, was very much something people on the right were talking about certainly under President Biden, and even to some extent, in President Trump's first term. So it's not. I don't think that argument or their other arguments we should just dismiss them as frivolous. I think we believe we need government to do things, and government, there's a lot of things that our society needs. And so what we need are safeguards to prevent, at least to keep corruption under control. One of the things that alarms me right now, right, is not government doing more. It's the erasure of all these safeguards, firing inspectors general, getting we haven't talked about it yet, but the idea the president has absolute control over every facet of the executive branch, including the watchdogs that are supposed to make sure that he and his appointees aren't on the take. This is troubling. But yes, government inherently, the bigger government is, the more potential there is for a certain amount of self-dealing. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have government do things, but it means that we need to create safeguards. Conservatives often were the people originally, in reaction to the New Deal, who wanted a certain amount of guardrails. That, you pointed out the Administrative Procedure Act, right, which is the law that sort of says that agencies have to follow certain processes. It was a conservative idea.
To rein in FDR and the regulatory agencies of that time.
They had a point.
They had a point, and people have come to accept that as the kind of the rules of the road. Let's turn the clock back and talk about the courts. Jane, yes.
I was just going to say one other thing. If you want to talk about how there are conservatives who are anti-corruption, and they're actually, if you take a look also, and of course that's true, but take a look at the tariff case right now, the Supreme Court that's going to be up in front of the Supreme Court. Some of the forces behind bringing that case are some of the more conservative people in the country. I think there's some of the Koch brothers' money is in that case, and they are, so the libertarian end of the conservative movement has been very suspicious of concentrated government power forever. And so they look at the tariffs, as you're saying, Michael, as a kind of a potential for abuses of power and corruption. And that's, I think, why Trump likes them. He gets to decide who to help
Once
and who
he
to
realized
hurt with
there was a kind of tax
tariffs.
he could personally
but there are
impose.
Conservatives who see it as a problem and are actually litigating over this right now.
We have filed a number of friend of the court briefs in these cases, including the case brought by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is backed by the Koch brothers and I believe by Leonard Leo, which, a new name for our holiday card list, I guess, that we weren't expecting to have. And
Strange bedfellows.
You never know. And the Cato Institute has been quite active on this and a number of other things. And this is, as former federal judge Michael McConnell, who's a prominent conservative, said, this is the biggest case on presidential power, the one that's being heard at the Supreme Court on November 6th, I think. He said it's the biggest case since the steel seizure case of 1952, because it just so directly calls the question of, wait a minute, can any president, unilaterally set worldwide tariffs that presidents can't set tax rates, and we've said, and others have said, and these conservative and business groups have said, no, it's not legal. And all the courts that have ruled on it have ruled that way too. It's going to be hard for the Supreme Court to avoid making a direct ruling. They can't sort of wiggle their way through this on the shadow docket like they have been in the many, many instances over the past 8 months where they've been largely giving President Trump overwhelmingly what he wants. I want to talk about that because you've written about dark money and the concerted effort to change the Constitution, how it's read, the political system. As we mentioned, you're writing a new book. The Supreme Court plays an extraordinary role here. So much of this is only happening or allowed because laws that previously had banned much of this stuff were struck down by a very activist Supreme Court largely well before Trump was president. And your point has been that this didn't just happen, that there was a really thought-through strategy to capture, in effect, this really powerful institution. And I hope I'm not caricaturing your views, but tell us what you think about that.
Okay, but Michael, I have to just say, you truly are the expert on this, having written a wonderful book about the history of the Supreme Court. So, and explained exactly how we got here. So, I'm going to defer back to you in a minute too, and press you for some answers here. But I think, what I've been looking at and trying to sort of tell the kind of the investigative history of is that there really was an extraordinary concerted effort, a campaign, if you will, by a handful of people in the right, to wage a kind of a counter-revolution to the Warren Court and to all of the things that progressives think of as reforms of the 1960s and 1970s, and even the reforms of Watergate. There was a group of people who seemed to be very much out on the fringe, on the far right fringe, that hated all those reforms and felt that it was pushing them out of power. And they joined forces, the economic conservatives, so there were sort of oligarchical plutocrats of the far right, like people like the Kochs, joined forces with the religious right, and basically plotted and schemed and fought and you got to say succeeded to an incredible degree. In taking back the courts, and it happened sort of under our noses, but to a large extent, liberals, the Democratic Party, paid pretty little attention to it. Certainly didn't fight back in the same way, and it was very different from what's happened before in terms of judicial politics, because it was so targeted, and it was an effort to literally seat judges on the Supreme Court who would give the decisions that this group wanted. It would help empower them further. And that's what we're dealing with. So in many ways, the Supreme Court has set the table for where we are now, I would argue.
And it was both who was on the court and then what the rulings were, and of course the when you think about the role over time played by the Federalist Society, just to give one example, I always looked at the Federalist Society and said, they're pretty effective, and they don't really seem to have. Interestingly, if you looked at their tax forms, they don't seem to have that much money. Well, it turns out that one donor gave Leonard Leo secretly Leonard Leo, our new friend, $1.6 billion to build that network. It was an extraordinarily well-organized and well-financed operation. And you've been so clear and really revelatory to me in kind of explaining the fusion between the economic forces and the social forces who were so upset in the 1970s by Roe v. Wade and other cases like that. And of course, as we know, James Bobb, the general counsel of the National Right to Life Committee, was the one who argued Citizens United. Dan, walk people through, because we have these all burned into our brains, about what the Supreme Court did over decades to get us to this point, starting in a way with Buckley versus Vallejo, but then really later cases were much more destructive.
No, I'm going to do that, and maybe also, as the person with the least expertise at the table, I'll just self-confidently plow ahead. But I think I'm going to also problematize this narrative a little bit, right? So this all starts in terms of campaign finance, right? With mid-century campaigns start to become mid-20th century campaigns start to become much more expensive because of the rise of modern mass communications, and not just in this country but all over the world. Governments started to say, well, we should probably put some limits on money in our elections, and in most of those countries like Canada and Europe, the logic was this is part of being equal citizens, right? Is one oligarch shouldn't be able to spend, at that point, millions of dollars on elections. The U.S. Supreme Court we did that after Watergate. The U.S. Supreme Court.
The U.S. had a system put into place with what attempted anyway to be full public financing for presidential campaigns, but also spending limits on campaigns, and and rich people couldn't fund their own campaigns.
Right, exactly. Now, that got in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a conservative challenge, and the court, in a opinion written by the namesake of the Brennan Center.
Justice Brennan.
We won't linger on that. Kind of from on high, said, "Oh no! You can't spending money on campaigns. That's like literal speech. You can't prohibit that. We'll let you prohibit donations to campaigns. But this talk of political equality, that's not an American value." And they fixated on this concept of corruption, right? As that is the justification. That our 9 lawyer friends on the Supreme Court decided was.
So you can't regulate, they said, and this is in Buckley v. Vallejo, not last week. You can't regulate. This was the first time that the Supreme Court had applied the First Amendment as the basis for understanding campaign finance law, as opposed to how do you have a working democracy? How do you have equal rights for voters?
Yeah, I don't know if it was the absolute, but it was the first big time that they did.
But they said the only basis can be corruption, and therefore you can limit contributions, but you can't limit spending. Since you can't corrupt yourself, you can spend the money on your own campaign and that sort of thing. And that sent us skittering off in a with a very kind of convoluted system.
Yeah, what I think is I think 2 things are interesting. One is I think that you have to remember this was at the start of the process Jane talked about, but this was also in some ways the last fumes of the Warren Court, right? This kind of very interventionist attitude that the court took. So I think those of us who look to the court to also solve social problems need to think about that a little bit in this context. The second thing was that for the decades after Buckley, then I think what the court did is they sort of stopped and they realized what they had done, and then they interpreted Buckley somewhat flexibly, right? So you get a series of decisions in the 80s and 90s where they say, yes, we said this, and then they sort of contort themselves into pretzels to uphold, a ban on corporate campaign spending, right, which is a ban on spending by corporations. And they say, this corruption, and that what they actually do is they try to stretch the definition of corruption. To encompass this rhetorically. Then, of course, the process that Jane described plays out. You've got changes of personnel in the court. That's what brings us to Citizens United, which doesn't really cover that much new ground so much as it slams the door shut on these efforts to kind of creatively interpret.
And I think it's really important, and Jane, you've written about this and talked about this. Citizens United really was, it turns out, an extraordinary breakpoint. It basically, and the cases that followed it, entirely deregulated money in politics. There's a few.
It's a complete watershed. It is why we are where we are. I mean, and as you're saying, there were antecedents. The one other thing I would add about the early cases, the Buckley case, Buckley v. Vallejo, in 1976, was take a look at who brought the case. We're talking about here today. We're talking about the sort of overpowering power of oligarchs. These were heirs to extremely big fortunes in this country who felt that they were at a disadvantage because they couldn't spend as much money as they wanted on politics. So who were they? And they're not just conservatives. One side you got James Buckley, the brother of William F. Buckley, and on the other side you've got Stuart Mott, who was an heir to the General Motors fortune and a big liberal. And the ACLU bought into this argument, which has also been important in this. And they equated their money, being able to spend all their money as, wasn't fair to not be able to allow them to, spend as much as they wanted on their elections. And they said that they were disadvantaged because they had ideas outside of the mainstream and they wanted to challenge incumbents and they needed to spend more. Anyway, the court bought this argument and began to define money as speech. And then, so that gets you up to, so there were still, as you're saying, a number of limits that the court applied. And if you look, I think there's a case in 2000 that is like Shrink Missouri, where the big balancing thing, Nixon versus Shrink Missouri, isn't that what it is? And different Nixon, but the idea, what we're looking at as we're working our way up to Citizens United, is that the court is trying to balance the idea of not corrupting American democracy against the right of people to have the freedom to express themselves in politics and spend money to do so. And it's a complicated balancing act, but the court, the people who were on the court in 2000, when they're handling this Missouri case, they understood the perils of corruption, and you can see it in their decision. But then the personnel changes about who's on the court. And again, what I've been watching is, how did they get the people on the court that would allow the richest people in the country to spend as much as they wanted? Well, some of the richest people in the country helped put those people on the court, and then the court, in some ways, it's much, much more subtle than this, but they return the favor in Citizens United because they allow people with tremendous amounts of money to just dominate American elections. The restraints are off. There are few figments of restraints. Anthony Kennedy writes the decision, and he says you can't be corrupt because it's going to be out in public. It's going to be, people will be accountable because their spending will be visible, and it's going to be independent of the candidates. You still can't give it directly to candidates. You can spend independently, and that's the safeguard we need. And people who knew politics warned at the time this was going to be a mess. And it turned out to be so. Not exactly the mess we all thought, right, Michael?
I thought,
maybe
right.
liberals thought it would be corporate spending.
Right. I thought it would be Exxon. But it turns out to be billionaires.
There's a kind of faculty lounge quality to all of this, don't you think, though? Whether it was payback or not, you've got these 9 people, none of whom actually, one of the big differences, right, is before Citizens United, you had at least one person who had been a politician on the court, Sandra Day O'Connor. She left. She's replaced by, you basically got sort of 9 elite lawyers. One thing that strikes me about it, and getting back to also the theme of corruption, is the sheer cynicism they have about politics, right? And this is true to some extent of the liberals on the court too, right, is that they really think that, to a certain extent, catering to donors, catering to wealthy benefactors is an integral part of the political process, and they are extremely hostile, or at least skeptical of any kind of sort of maybe naive notion of public service as a public trust. And that also has infused a lot of their jurisprudence, frankly, even when they're getting the law right. So they're
very condescending to the politicians.
They're very condescending.
And the political system, and therefore, in a way, the voters. You saw it in Shelby County 3 years later, as well, where Scalia said, well, the Voting Rights Act passed the Congress 98-0. That proves nobody read it, and that sort of thing.
And Jay made a really good point. It's like it's never clear how much they know what they're doing, but it's also, there's a lot that they say in Citizens United that they were just wrong. Like, they didn't understand how the
there wasn't
process
independence,
was working.
and there isn't disclosure. And of course, that's the dark money. The dark money phenomenon, which, for those who don't know, is undisclosed money in electoral process. The last election, our analysis, in the last federal election, it was $1.9 billion, which was nearly double what it had been 4 years before. And Jane, you've written about this so well. What's particularly, I realize this is a kind of an easy pitch down the middle, I imagine, but what's bad about dark money, and why is it different from other money in a way?
Well, I mean, it from my standpoint as a reporter, it's important to have accountability. Particularly if you're trying to figure out if something is corrupt, you need to know who gave the money and what their ulterior motives might have been. And if you can't see their fingerprints on a donation, you can't tell if somebody's bribing or attempting to bribe a politician, or if maybe they're just doing, giving out of the goodness of their hearts. And so there are a lot of moneyed interests trying to buy influence in a country like the United States, and it makes it impossible to connect the dots. When it's dark money, you can't see it. It interferes with this process of accountability, which is in itself so important to have if you're going to have an honest democracy. So it's inhibiting the rights of people to know whether public servants are serving the public.
And again, using the tools of governmental power on whose behalf. But of course, now with the almost entirely deregulated environment post Citizens United, some of the most astounding expenditures are not secret, are not dark money. I mean, we talk about Elon Musk. He spent $250 million, it basically paid for much of the winning presidential campaign. He also simultaneously had in X and Twitter a very powerful media platform that was very helpful to the winning presidential campaign. He then, that was all because of what the Supreme Court did, that he was able to do that. Now, what's so striking, of course, is that he then literally moved into the White House, slept on a cot, and was for a few months given effectively prime ministerial authority to illegally destroy a lot of government agencies. And again, we talk about the Gilded Age, but John D. Rockefeller didn't pay for McKinley's campaign and then move into the White House. It just has this stuff is at such a gargantuan public scale. You wrote a brief in a case the Supreme Court is hearing right now about a fairly arcane set of topics, which is the party coordination rules. And the point you made in the brief is that, interestingly, the Brennan Center has actually argued for letting parties raise more money because it's actually a better way to do it. But the point you've made is the Supreme Court constitutionalizing everything, claiming everything is free speech, should not be coming in and rewriting the minutia of campaign finance law. And that's what they've done.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're a long way from a night or two in the Lincoln bedroom, right? If you've got someone sleeping in the Oval Office night after night with his kid, interestingly. But
it was a busy house.
It's a busy house. So yeah, so the new Supreme Court case coming before the court, right, implicates these somewhat esoteric rules that limit how much political parties can spend in coordination with their own candidates. Won't get into the details of why those exist. There are justifications for them, but there is also a good argument that we like political parties, and whether they have flaws or not, they're an essential part of our democracy. So letting them work with their candidates is not a bad thing. And I actually think that points to a flaw in many anti-corruption campaigners, right? We talk about the naivete of the Supreme Court or the sort of faculty lounge attitude of the Supreme Court. We should acknowledge the distaste for politics that also exists among reformers, right? And politics is dirty.
The goo-goos, as they're known.
Goo-goos,
as we are affectionately known at times.
And yet don't want to identify ourselves. But the point that we made in this brief was that whatever you think about that, it's actually a complicated question of whether these limits should be repealed. I think they do actually serve some anti-corruption purpose, but they also jerry-rig our political system in a weird way that is perhaps not very helpful. The Supreme Court is not the institution that should be sorting this out, particularly this Supreme Court, which doesn't even allow for a factual record, right, to be created in these cases. I mean, this is like Law 101, right? Normally, courts develop a factual record. They rule on the legal issues based on the factual record they've developed. And in these constitutional cases, usually that involves a lot of consideration of why the legislature actually did the thing it did. They've dispensed with that entirely, and instead we have these opinions that are like logic games, right? And so in that circumstance, they've done this again and again. Citizens United made a number of promises, right, that the spending would be independent, that the spending would be transparent. I'm fairly convinced they just didn't really understand how this worked, and so they made these sort of airy promises, and it turned out they were wrong. The brief walks through those examples and says we should probably have a conversation about how we want party fundraising to be regulated. That conversation should happen in Congress. I mean, there's a dimension that we haven't really talked about here, which is that Congress, a lot of what we are seeing now is because Congress has kind of either abdicated or been pushed aside from a lot of these conversations, right? Congress gave, to some extent, the president has exceeded his authority. The Congress has also given the president some authority over tariffs.
And I want to turn to that question of what do we do about all this. Right. And of course, we've talked a lot about Trump and the Trump administration and the extraordinary difference it has made in the executive branch. Of course, Congress is awash in money as well. Mm-hmm. And even some of the self-dealing issues that you see in the executive branch with all the stock trading is a real challenge in Congress, and you have almost classic instances where an industry throws a ton of money into campaign spending and lobbying the crypto industry and really changed the policy out of Congress, defeated Sherrod Brown as a senator in Ohio, and got a bill out of Congress, or a bill moving through Congress at least, that was entirely, it seems, a product of kind of all the tools of money that we know exist. One question I have for you, Jim, before we turn to the question about solutions. What's so novel right now is not only that the federal government is moving heaven and earth to do what the fossil fuel industry wants after massive contributions to Trump's campaign, or the extraordinary policy dimensions, whether it's tech or tariffs, of these very wealthy individuals. But what's different, too, is, as you've said, is about the personal self-dealing and the flagrancy of the self-dealing by Trump and his family. And I sometimes worry that I'm not upset enough about this. It's distasteful, it's bad, but sometimes in some ways it doesn't seem like it's as society shaping as some of the other bigger things. Do you agree with that, or do you think that there's something really fundamentally rotten in this that really rises to the same level?
Excuse me. I think it matters if the president and his family are corrupt. I mean, I've covered other countries where, Indonesia, where they used to have someone who they called Madam 10%, take 10% off of everything. The idea that the government is so corrupt from the top is very alienating to everybody else in the country. They become cynical, they check out, they lose faith in our system. I mean, I think it's spiritually, morally, politically corrupting to everyone when the people on the top behave like this. And it's quite fascinating that they're doing it so in the open. I think it's interesting as a reporter, because usually as an investigative reporter, you're digging for the thing that's going to shock people and show the truth, and then there will be reaction. Well, right now what we've got is it's out in the open, and people seem to be frozen. Congress is frozen. It's not doing what you expect it to do, which is be upset and demand reform. It's stuck. The whole system seems to be kind of stunned and stuck in the face of this corruption. So, I mean, I do think it certainly matters. I guess I think in the end of the day, that it's up to people like us who think it is a bad thing to do a better job explaining to the rest of the country why they should care. If you're feeling like you don't care enough, try to think, Michael Waldman, what is it about it that's okay with you, and what would upset you about it? Because we have to communicate to people if there's something really wrong here, what it is and why it matters to them. And I think we have to bring it home to people in their own lives, and explain it. When the government's corrupt, it's going to affect your life. You're going to be exposed to toxic chemicals. You're going to have meat that's not inspected. You're going to have, you're not going to be able to afford college for your kid, because the siphoning off of all that money is going to other places. I mean, there are a lot of things, and we need to make clear to people why it matters, I think.
I think that's
But
true.
you tell me.
I mean,
why does it not?
You need to give practical examples. So, I just one off the top of my head: the dismembering of the CFPB, right? Administration campaigned actually on economic populism. There's a way that you would think that the CFPB would be something they'd want to use for they're very concerned about things like debanking, right? Instead, they ripped it apart, and it's basically moribund. That agency has returned billions of dollars to American consumers. So every time you go and have a bad experience with online banking, that's taken away a safeguard that was there, that was supposed to be fighting for people to get a fair shake, in online commerce. there are a lot of examples like that, and it's not always just at the hands of it's the hands of both parties.
And it's that people also, I think, Jane, you make the point that when Trump has a meme coin, and when people basically are paying him billions of dollars, foreign interests often, through deregulated finance, people get why that is drains away the legitimacy of government, leads to bad policies, and again, potentially policies that they really don't like, and they make the connection, or do they? I mean, that's part of the goal is to take this out of the.
We have to help people make that connection. Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle in 1906, where he was trying to expose the corruption and horrors in the slaughterhouse industry, and he was, classic muckraking journalism. And what and it had a huge effect. The FDA grew out of this. The president had him to the White House to talk about it. So you could see that it had reaction. But what he said famously about it was, I aimed for America's heart and I hit its stomach. And what people didn't care about the plight of the workers in the slaughterhouses, which is what he thought he was exposing. They cared because they were afraid they were going to find a human finger in their hot dog. And I think the thing is, we need to make clear to people, you're going to find a human finger in your hot dogs. There is an effect on your life day to day when regulations that have been, denounced by big business, when they remove those regulations, it's going to hurt a lot of people. And we have to somehow make clear to people about what happens when the rules of the game are corrupted. Bad things happen.
And it's not. This is not abstract. It's not aesthetic distaste for the grubbery of politics. This is distortion of power. It's about power in ways that affect people a great deal. And at the times in American history where there have been moments of change and moments of reform, people have often scandal is followed often, though not always, by a season of scandal is often followed by a time of reform, especially when people think that it affected them. And one of the challenges we face right now, so on the one hand, corruption in a YouGov poll in August was listed as the top issue over inflation. And at some level, watching what's unfold, even without the news media doing its full job, or even able to do its full job to tell the story, people are getting it in one way or another. But they're very cynical about anything being done to change it. They think everybody's in on it. Nothing can change. And one of the questions is both a political question of how does one mobilize that broad public distaste, but also how do we make sure that the solutions are big enough to address the problems as they are right now. The wave of reforms that came after Watergate was from the mid-1970s. And it's not enough for us to try to defend or reinstate somehow those 1970s safeguards. What are the things that are big enough and are relevant right now, whether it's the self-dealing in the Oval Office or the role of the Supreme Court or how campaign money is flowing now? What are some of the kinds of things that we need to look at?
Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely right that politically the issue of corruption is very much up for grabs. I mean, I think we should pause to realize one of the reasons people may be upset by corruption they see, say, with Trump, it's not clear that they see Democrats as credible alternatives on that. So,
well, and Trump said drain the swamp, and people thought because he was wealthy he wouldn't be corrupt.
Well, and when a lot of people tend to think that he's corrupt, but he's honest about it, and I think that anyone who is, whether you're Democrat or Republican, should take that seriously as how the voters feel. I think part of it is proposing ambitious solutions. I think that there is often a tendency to sort of get really, really granular without that sort of larger vision. To me, the two things that stand out, one is through sort of a historical accident, we don't apply any of the rules or most of the rules we have for government corruption to anyone at the top of our government. The president, Congress, and the Supreme Court are all exempt from all of them. It's always been sort of an honor system for them. That sets a tone for the rest of the government. So we have to do something to fix that. And there are lots of proposals out there that we could get into, but basically saying, no, the president can't just legally engage in this sort of self-dealing.
A lot of these are in the bill called the Protecting Our Democracy
Yes.
Act, which dealt with things like the emoluments clause of the Constitution, enforcing it, as well as things like the independence of the Justice Department and a number of those other things. Then there are the campaign finance rules. As you know, as we know, Congress came very close to enacting some pretty good campaign finance reforms just 3 years ago. The Freedom to Vote Act included legislation that would expose the dark money and other things. It also, as you know, included a ban on partisan gerrymandering and mid-decade redistricting, which would have stopped in its tracks in advance what's going on right now, and quite a few voting reforms, such as automatic voter registration. What it didn't really include, as it moved through, was public financing of campaigns or small donor public financing. We think that that's a really important reform. It's being used in New York State and New York City to very good effect, but it's a new generation of that reform. There's also the possibility of sooner or later taking on Citizens United and through constitutional amendments, and we need to think. One of the things, if you look at the progressive era, the Upton-Sinclair era, their versions of the reform response to the corruption and Gilded Age some of it was campaign finance reform, the Tillman Act, which was the ban on corporate campaign spending. Teddy Roosevelt was the first one to propose public financing, but they also broadened their lens. The 17th Amendment, which had direct election of senators by voters, was their view of how to do campaign finance reform, because the legislatures were so corrupt and were bought and sold. And so among the answers, we think, are things like term limits for Supreme Court justices to bring that institution more into a state of accountability. We've got a bunch of audience questions that I want to share. And the first one really is for you, Jane, wearing your journalist hat. This is from Paul Roden. He asks, we're having this conversation just shortly after Robert Redford died. Where is our generation's deep throat? In other words, he asks, can we expect to ever find out the full extent of this administration's corruption, or do we need that kind of digging when it's so in public?
I mean, we need all of it. I am a great believer in protecting sources and having, going to the ends of the earth to make sure that they're not prosecuted. We definitely need all kinds of information. It's become, if anything, it feels much more threatening now to be a reporter, and I think it's much more threatening for people inside the government to try to get the truth out. So, I'd like to see more support for that in any way. I mean, we need to have source protection nationally, I think. We have state laws that protect it, but not nationally. Anyway, I do believe. I mean, I'm a perpetual optimist, despite all of this. That good people exist in the government who do want to tell the truth, and around the government, and they're still great reporters writing great stories. And we just kind of need more help getting the word out, and not overcomplicating things. I think there's a tendency to write, when you cover this stuff, write too much about the numbers and not enough about the people. Mm-hmm. Who's hurt, who's helped, who's Marie Antoinette now, who are the good guys. We need to really make clear why it matters in everybody's lives. And I agree with you guys. It's a very... I think the subject of cleaning up corruption and reforming democracy is very popular in a bipartisan way. If you look at polls, A lot of conservatives really dislike the Citizens United decision, and almost everybody dislikes the idea of billionaires controlling our elections. And there's a lot of support. I think it's part of the reason Trump got elected in the first place, as you said, to drain the swamp. And he attacked the Kochs actually in 2016. And I think it's a lot of the reason that Bernie Sanders is one of the most popular politicians, and maybe why Mamdani is popular in New York. There's a great feeling of hunger for reform in this area, and I hope that smart people figure out how to capture it and use it and do good with it.
This is it is. I really think that the issue of the future. There's, as you said, there's wide, across the political spectrum, anger and understanding of it. And the question is, how will the political system respond? And will some batch of politicians who have their own self-interest in mind seize it? Will civil society push them to do it? And while it's true that we don't have, Watergate, as you know, Walter Cronkite devoted 12 whole minutes to Watergate on the CBS Evening News. It was a really big deal, but it was only a few newspapers and outlets that focused on Watergate at first. We now have the nonprofit news world like ProPublica doing the exposés on the Supreme Court. We're going to have to find ways to expose what's going on, as Jane said, to show the stakes to people, and how this stuff affects their lives within the new media landscape, and not bellyache about we can't do it anymore. One of the questions we have from V.S. Mitchell is something we haven't really talked about: is the Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision enabling the corrupt conduct we're seeing now?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it depends on which immunity decision. The Supreme Court decision, absolutely, if it's interpreted. And this is Trump v. U.S.
Yeah,
Trump v. As I said, if it's interpreted in the most, frankly, crazy and a broad way some people have been interpreting, and yes, it's a game changer, right? It could potentially completely reshape how we, and remove the president from a tremendous degree of accountability. What was interesting, the dynamics of the court in that decision, right, between the majority and Justice Barrett, right, is that there is a narrower view of it that I think will be less harmful, and ultimately that question isn't entirely settled. So that decision is very much something that we need to think about, and is also something that we need to try to push for it to be as narrowly interpreted as possible. And there was an interesting exchange specifically on, could you ever convict the president for bribery, right, under this decision? I thought Justice Barrett, if you go read the decision, had a sort of more thoughtful approach than the other justices. And this is one where, as misguided as I think that decision was, I do hope that we can get a little bit to this idea the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And ultimately, we have to have a political system in which everyone, including the people at the very top, are not above the law.
But for that to happen, the cases have to involve prosecutions.
Right. And
if the folks in the executive branch all choose to interpret this as giving free range to whatever illegal conduct, and Trump, as president, can pardon people who do things that otherwise might be deemed illegal, it's a pretty broad, and I think that the challenge for us as both as analysts and as people who sometimes litigate is I think that to me, one of the things that was most destructive in that case was John Roberts embracing the most radical notion of the unitary executive theory. He said the presidency is the only branch of government that is a person. Mm-hmm. And that has both enabled Trump to try to treat the rest of the executive branch as though they're all his employees, like they're gardeners, at Mar-a-Lago. But again, supercharges the corruption. Jane, perhaps an unfair question, and you really touched on it, Jane. What gives you hope at a moment like this, and what can we hope for?
I was a student of history, and in college and graduate school, and so I think if you look at the longer sweep, what you see in the area of corruption in this country, anyway, are waves of corruption and then waves of reform, and we've been through corrupt periods before, and we have had reforms. We're way overdue now, but I'm not sure why we would defy history at this point. So that's some hope.
You're exactly right, that it's at moments like this that kindle a public response, and very often a legal and governmental response. This is The Briefing. It's the Brennan Center's new experimental podcast that gives us a chance to delve into these issues in some depth, and we're really glad to be able to do so. So thank you both for being part of it.